So it is my pleasure to invite you to the second face-to-face series, masterclass in our NatWest series. So this is a series that's been running since 2015. We had the interruption with the pandemic, but we're absolutely delighted to be able to host it and have folks in the management school in our new building, breathing life into it. So it's absolutely wonderful, absolutely delighted that you're here. This masterclass series is absolutely fantastic because it gives an opportunity for us to hear thought leaders in the really sort of pertinent topics and challenges, issues which are challenging business at the moment. And it also gives us a fantastic opportunity to network. So I'm delighted to welcome old friends back and hopefully new people who will become friends of the series. So this evening, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Sue Garrard. She is, according to the polls, one of the top 100 women influencers. But as I said to her, I think actually I'd put her down as one of the top 100 influencers, both male and female, in this area of sustainability. This is the theme of the Masterclass series this year. So Sue has a very varied background, and I think that helps bring a lot of different insights into sustainability. So she worked in government. She was also the executive vice president in Unilever, and just to get the correct title, for sustainable business and communications, so helping Unilever develop its sustainability strategy. She runs her own business, is an advisor on sustainability, and helps businesses want to take that next step in this area. She's also the chair of an independent, not-for-profit organisation, Blueprint for Better Business. So I think, really, I'm going to, without further ado, let Sue do the talking and hear what she's got to say. Now, Sue would like this to be really interactive. So if you do have any questions, if you could please put your hands up, and Adam and Claire will bring the mic to her, and we can have a good chat. So I think we've got about an hour to really listen and learn and interact. So, Sue.
Great. Job number one, turn the clicker on. It's great to be here. 5 hours on the M6. Not quite so good. Obviously, train strike. But I'm also conscious that I'm probably standing between you and a beer and a barbecue somewhere. So I hope we're going to make this worthwhile, because it's just stunning, isn't it? And of course, it's very early in the year to have these temperatures, but we'll come on to that. I had a quick scan of the list of companies, and obviously a lot of them I don't know because they are local. I did get a sense there's a really wide spread in the room, which is fantastic. I hope you're all really opinionated and are going to join in a conversation, so it's not just me blathering on for 45 minutes and you looking on politely. Of course, what I have no sense of at all in the room is, in your own organisations, where you are on looking at what you need to do with sustainability, and how much you really feel you know. And I wanted to do something funky on a Mentimeter, and then I just decided it was going to be simple to do the good old-fashioned manual way and get you to stick your hands up. So I just want to start by a really quick temperature test, because it will give me a sense, of just a tiny bit at least, of who I'm talking to. So first question, who in the room would say that they would regard themselves as an expert in sustainability? I know one person that will put their hand up. Okay, two? Was that a maybe? 2.5? Okay, 3? That's good. Okay, so the bullshitter's guide will work. And who would say that in your role running your organisation, that you feel you're on top of sustainability, got a plan, are clear how you're going to execute that plan, and generally feeling that you're confident about that area? Who would put themselves in that category? Okay, so it would be interesting to see, with a maybe there, I think. It'd be interesting to see how you feel, but also for those that put their hands up, other people in the audience will learn as much from you and what you're doing as they will from me. And who would say that they're absolutely at the beginning of that journey and starting to think about it? Okay, so quite a good spread, that's good. So I was asked to talk about a blueprint for sustainable business, and indeed I will do that, but I'm going to cover two things before that. I'm going to talk about actually how bad the situation really is, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get a temperature test, if you'll pardon the pun, about the level of knowledge you feel you've all got. And note that we're talking here about sustainability, not just climate, although climate is what's dominating enormously at the moment for understandable reasons. So I'm going to touch on that. And again, please do feel free to interject as we go. Then I'm going to give you a sense of what I see in terms of corporate attitudes. And of course, it's a huge generalization, but talking about what I see, some of the very common trends in business leaders up and down the country in the UK at the moment, partly so you can kind of situate yourself in that context, and partly to reflect on what that means in the context of what we've heard about the first point, which is how bad it is really. And then I'm going to boil down my blueprint for starting. So for those of you who put their hand up on the, are you doing a good job? You will probably find this very bread and butter. But for those of you who are just at the start, I think these are very simple steps that every business can take. It doesn't cost you very much money, and every single business needs to take. And then we'll hopefully get into a debate about, okay, what are the stages beyond that? How do you deal with the tensions and so on and so forth? So you've already heard a brief introduction to me, but I just wanted to give you a sense of where my points of view and the information I'm going to share with you has come from. Obviously, as you know, I've spent 8 years at Unilever, and for the latter part of that was responsible for sustainability. I would say I was not a sustainability expert when I started that role. I was thrown in at the deep end, so I'm proof that actually you can very much learn this stuff on the job. The second is that I now do a lot of keynotes and panels, and what that means is I sit next to fantastic people. By far the most fantastic, if any of you can see it on that micro slide, was David Attenborough, definitely my highlight of my career. But I sit next to lots of very bright people and lots of people like you in the audience, and you get a feeling of what's going on and take the pulse. I also sat at a very senior level in government, so I've seen what it's like from the other side, where you're looking at what government interventions could be made, but then you're looking at the realpolitik of how change actually happens in government and what can and can't be done. I tutor now extensively with the University of Cambridge, who have an institute, and that's targeted at senior executives. So, for example, 2 weeks ago, I was tutoring the leadership team of a company called Berry Global, which is one of the 3 biggest global plastic packaging companies in the world. So seeing what senior executives of really very big businesses, but also very small businesses, are wrestling with. I run my own business, so here's just a smattering of the kinds of clients that I've been working with in the last year or so. And then I chair this organisation called A Blueprint for Better Business. And the principle of it is really simple, which is how can you reconnect business with society? And the purpose of this organisation is to try and create a better society through better business. And better really means, in this context, it means getting back to the roots of what started. And those of you who work in smaller businesses, I think, will really identify with this. Why businesses were started in the first place. You know, most entrepreneurs have an idea and a passion, and they have a sense, in a lot of cases, they have a sense of understanding of where society is and what the needs are. And what they're doing innately is serving those needs. And what Blueprint is seeking to do is to help leaders of enormous organisations, by the way, including NatWest, who are the sponsors today. So we work very, very closely with Alison Rose, who is the CEO. And if you look at their annual report, you will see that Alison is now injecting a much deeper sense of social purpose into how NatWest is run, based on the principles that we've created for Blueprint. And that's just one fantastic example of the kind of work that we do for free, because we're a charity. So, how bad is it really? And depressingly, it really wasn't very hard when I spent half an hour on Google to find very current examples that are fairly local of extreme weather having very real impacts on people's lives, businesses' lives, farmers' lives. Every walk of life already is being very directly impacted. And what we've thought about as a future problem for a very long time isn't a future problem anymore. But I think it's very hard to get your head around just how bad it really is. And so what I want to do is just spend 5 minutes now looking at, first of all, the linked web of environmental issues, and then I'm going to look at the same for social issues. And crucially, what's important to recognise is that the two are very fundamentally interlinked. And anybody who's heard the language of a Green New Deal, that's fundamentally what it's about, is recognising that the choices we make now as a society and as an economy about how we're going to manage the environmental damage we've created to our planet and our chances of continuing to live a decent life on it are fundamentally linked to social outcomes, because, as with everything else, it's the poorest in societies all around the world that are most badly affected and least able to cope, but where the opportunity to be involved in being part of the solution is really very significant. So, to start with, who can tell me what the IPCC's latest advice, and if just the two people who said they're experts could not answer, that would be good. Who else feels confident that you know what the IPCC has said we need to do in terms of reducing carbon emissions in order to have a chance of avoiding runaway climate change? Can you express it as a percentage? Can everybody hear this? You'll need to speak loudly.
20 gigatons.
Express it as a percentage of current emissions. Okay, anybody want to build on that? Does everybody know what the IPCC is? Is it helpful if I decode all this? So this is where, give me feedback, because the more I get the feedback, the more I can help you. So the IPCC is basically the body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is what it stands for. So that's what the abbreviation unpacked is. But importantly, it's all the scientists around the world who study some element of climate, who then build the models based on what's happened in the past and current readings to project forward, to look at what the impact of different scenarios is on our climate. And it is they who very recently issued a code red for humanity, saying that unless we halve our carbon emissions by the end of this decade versus the start of industrial times, we probably have no chance of avoiding runaway heating. And runaway heating will result in up to a 6 degrees increase in temperature by the end of this century. And that level of heating is unsurvivable in most parts of the world by most species. So the reason I wanted to start there is because I think we hear lots of stuff, and you see things like this on the news. You see the floods, you see the fires, you see it in California, now you see it in Germany. The reality is that actually we have a vanishingly thin amount of time left in which to act to basically decarbonize our economies, because all of our economies have been built on the fantastic benefits of fossil fuel. But because none of the downsides of those have been costed in, we do not have an economy that is based on the true cost. Okay? And if you take one thing away from today, getting your mind around that is absolutely fundamental, because no matter how difficult all the other challenges are, and I'm going to come on and talk about that, unless we tackle that, then we face catastrophe in a relatively short period of time. Any of you with children, their children will be facing levels of disruption that are literally unimaginable. So that's bad enough as it is. That's greenhouse gas emissions. Yes?
May I ask a question?
Of course, please do.
So what proportion of global CO2 emissions is the UK responsible for?
Well, that depends how you measure it. If you look at it since emissions started, very big, because we, of course, were the inventors of the Industrial Revolution. So we were producing very large amounts of this stuff decades before any other civilized and mature economy. Now, China represents significantly more emissions than any other major country. America comes second, and we are in the top 10. If what's behind your question is, does what we do matter? I don't know if it is.
Well, it was a genuine question.
Yes.
But it does lead on to speculating or asking oneself, well, okay, say the UK CO2 emissions went to zero.
Yes.
Would that save us?
Not on its own. No, not on its own. What it would do, what it is already doing, is it's driving the other bigger economies to see, A, that it's doable, and B, that there are economic advantages, and there are health advantages, and there are social advantages. So it creates all sorts of other social and economic benefits. And it creates the kind of pressure that you need in a policy-making environment like the UN, which is essentially voluntary. And so our big problem with this, of course, is we have every atom of carbon, or indeed methane, emitted anywhere in the world affects all of us. So this is genuinely a truly global problem. And we have very ambiguous global governance. It exists, but obviously it can't force change. But what we're already seeing is that increasingly economies in each of those big markets understand where the future lies. And so you're seeing market shifts in big countries, and you're seeing policy shifts in big countries. We're already seeing, for example, that although China set a target for net zero 2060, whereas most other mature economies are aiming for 2050, they're already beating their own self-imposed targets because, A, they're seeing the damage. China's very badly damaged by some elements of climate change. And B, they're seeing the economic benefits of being leaders. So they're installing more solar power than the whole of the rest of the world, for example. So I think it's really important, and I'm really glad you asked that question because, the biggest risk we face is protectionism, isolationism, and what difference does it make? Every atom that everybody's involved in producing matters. And psychologically, we have to make a real step to one side to believe that we can decarbonise and still have a good standard of life. It's completely possible. What we need is an economic engine that funds that transition. That was a slightly long answer, but important to unpack what sat below that. Shall I carry on? Okay. Yeah. And you will see me say something about that a bit later on. So let's pick up on that in the, so wherever you buy stuff from, it's got emissions attached, okay? So let's keep that thought because it's a very important one. So you will notice it's 1820, well, you won't, but I will because I've got a clock up there, that it's 1821 and I've got to slide 1. So I'll try and speed up a bit so I get the relevant stuff at the end. But the point here really is, all I've talked about so far is one of these 6 boxes, right? And really all I've talked about is carbon, when in fact methane is 80 times more damaging over a 10-year period. And we know the 2 main emitters of that, and that can be solved. So we need to see some serious action in that space. It's fundamentally linked to biodiversity. And we're seeing a drastic loss of biodiversity, which matters for all sorts of reasons. But from a very kind of selfish, humanity-based one, it matters because a lot of biodiversity loss means loss of pollinators. And about half of our grain-based food comes from pollination. And there are actually huge industries already in the States where people are manually pollinating things because there aren't enough pollinators left. And trust me, that business model is finite and unaffordable. Most of the world is going to see drought. 50% of it is going to face constant chronic drought by the end of this decade. I think probably a little further west than here, you're not going to have quite so much trouble. But even down in the southeast where I live, we already see very serious water shortages. We're already seeing movements of whole capital cities as a result of drought. We're already seeing parts of sub-Saharan Africa that are unfarmable because of drought. So, you know, if you think about the social implications I'm going to come and talk about in a minute, they're very profound. Forests are crucial because they're the lungs of the planet. Many scientists now think that we've reached a tipping point with the Amazon that used to be described as the lungs of the planet and was certainly the most important area of natural forest on the planet, has now been so deforested that it's now probably a net contributor to carbon emissions, which is shocking. Does anybody know what the primary driver of deforestation is? We've got palm oil, cattle. Yeah. So there are four major crops. A lot of the initial drivers for deforestation of the Amazon was the US market demand for beef, and gradually beef rearing just basically headed south. And Mr. Bolsonaro, who now runs Brazil, appears to think that it's a completely disposable resource, which is very worrying. All this really brings you to a question of land use. What land is going to be usable, the competition for that land use. You know, if you work for Primark, one of my ex-clients, and you're the world's biggest buyer of cotton, you're going to be competing with land crops very soon in the future. And then we have plastic pollution, where we are looking at all the things that any organisation has done having no impact. The level of plastic pollution in the sea is going up, not down. It's projected to do that for at least the next 20 years, by which time not only will there be more plastic than fish in the ocean, but the fish that exists will be probably inedible. So, you know, these are very, very profound questions, and I could expand in a lot of detail, but we don't have time. But then I mentioned that there is a serious link with social issues. Here in the top left, population growth. We're currently at about 7.8 billion on this planet. That's forecast to grow by about 2 billion by 2050. So if you think about the human impact of all the pressures that I described on that previous slide, and then you ask the planet to accommodate another 2 billion people to feed them, clothe them, transport them, do all the things that we need, you can see, if you look at the Earth and humanity as a system, a linked system, that is a colossal amount of additional pressure. And that's another reason why there's an urgency not just to do iterative change, but really to step change the way that we run our economies. That's linked directly to the middle one on the top, which is urbanization. All of that population increase will live in cities. If you think just 30 years ago in some countries, we had significantly less than 50% of populations living in cities and the remainder living in rural areas, and what the impact of that is, and also a profound connection or disconnection with nature. The number of people who reconnected with hearing birds sing was one of the classic things that people talked about during COVID. So simple, for anyone rural, you take it for granted, but actually urbanization creates enormous problems at a number of different levels. And of course, they're not going to be nice cities like Lancaster. They're going to be slums. Which government in the world is going to be able to afford to build green new cities for all these people? So thinking about where those people go and the pressures that creates on the Earth system is very profound. Unless somebody does anything about it, we're going to see continued inequality in terms of income. We're seeing a huge gap still between the life chances for men and women. I'm delighted to see so many women in the audience today. Wish that there was more equality in other parts of society. You see profound issues with labour rights. And all of this really comes together to say the sorts of things that we're seeing, you know, most recently and tragically as a result of the Ukraine invasion, with requests for people to move country, is a tiny dot compared with the levels of migration that we are going to see in the coming 2 decades, with estimates of somewhere between 10 million upwards, simply finding that their land they live in is uninhabitable. So you think about that from a physical, geographical, political, economic point of view. We are looking at very fundamental shifts. So again, the more rapidly we can build a future economy that's got resilience, not for all of these issues, but for some of them, the better. So, can you do this? You know what the answer is, really, don't you? But it was a cute picture, and I thought we needed something a bit more light-hearted after all that. And this is another picture I couldn't resist putting up. It's a deer literally stuck and then died between a rock and a hard place. But I think context is important because, you know, and again, particularly with the work I'm doing with Cambridge, talking to business leaders all the time, I think probably there has not been more difficult operating situations since the Second World War for a business leader. And you've got this cocktail of issues going on, dealing with COVID, which of course we know is actually still with us, although we'd like to think that it wasn't. On top of that, dealing with Brexit, which some people, and my personal view is one of the greatest acts of self-harm that an economy could actually make. The unfathomable behaviour, frankly, that's led to the Ukraine war, and then massive supply chain problems, of course, not all caused by this guy who couldn't steer his boat down the Suez Canal, but it certainly didn't help. You know, that's extraordinary as a set of pressures. And now we're looking at massive escalation in the cost of living. Just driving up here today, 9.1% inflation rate announced this morning. Fuel costs going through the roof. Fuel, fertiliser and food costs all directly aligned. It's an unbelievable cocktail, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. And then on top of all that, for any of you who have people that own a share in your business, whether it's a listed business or not, you don't have permission, really, to do anything that deviates from your ability to deliver whatever your promised quarterly returns are. And trust me, I know, having been at a senior level in Unilever for 8 years, the tyranny of the pressure to deliver quarter after quarter is absolutely all-consuming for a lot of senior business leaders. And so how do you reconcile all this and then go, oh, and by the way, this thing you know very little about, we just want you to take your carbon emissions out, we want you to try and source in a way that improves biodiversity. What are you doing about that plastic packaging? It would be very understandable. And frankly, a lot of businesses, particularly smaller businesses, are going, I just don't have time for that now. I'm just going to have to concentrate on staying afloat, dealing with the things right in front of me, and I completely get that. But if most businesses do that, let me tell you what the outcome will be. And it's infectious. So somehow we have to find a way of coping for today, but planning for tomorrow. So the reasons that I hear all the time are about money. Will it make me money? I don't have any money. They're about bandwidth, as I've mentioned. These are the things, every single discussion that I have, these are the reasons that come up. Is there enough customer push? That's varied very much by sector. A very strong feeling that actually businesses will move when governments make them. I'm going to talk to you about the massive risk associated with that. And very simply, you know, I don't know where to start. I started my business because I'm good at making cheese or being a lawyer or all of the things that you in this audience are, not because I'm a sustainability expert, and it's very, very baffling. But the mood is shifting, and this is a tweet from just literally a couple of months ago about, I mean, with extraordinary language about the role that fossil fuel companies are playing. I don't know if there's anyone from the fossil fuel industries here today. If you are, you may know who said this, so please don't give it away. But, you know, this is language that is very radical. Would anyone like to take a guess at who said it? And if you know, please don't spoil the surprise. Who do you think said it? Greta? Trump? Any advances? The Pope? Antonio Guterres, head of the United Nations. So remember what I was saying about the world's governing attempt at global governance? The guy who's in charge of this is now saying, he's using language you would expect of Extinction Rebellion. And he's doing that because he can see that we are on a collision course with a very, very unsolvable problem if we don't move at speed. So the mood is really changing, but the mood is not translating quickly enough into action. And that's a problem. But there's been a huge piece of work done, and this is the result of about 5 major organisations putting together all the data that they can. And what it proves unequivocally is that the cost of inaction, i.e. doing nothing, that, oh, hang on, that goes in the too hard box, I'm just going to wait a bit, or any of the other reasons that we heard, is going to be much, much greater than the cost of action. So yes, doing stuff on sustainability will cost you some money in some areas, depending on what you do. But if you don't, Mark Carney, when he was still Governor of the Bank of England, said, businesses that ignore climate will probably fail. And he's right. And the reason, as I said earlier, is because we've been running our businesses based on a false view of what the cost is. We've not actually had to pay for a lot of the resources that we've taken for granted. And so we don't have a true cost economic model at a global, a national, or an individual corporate level. And this is the key thing that every business now starts to address and to understand what their true cost really is. And the forces of change are not going to go away. In fact, they're going to get worse and they're going to accelerate. So although you may feel that this is something that you can do at your own pace or you can delay because it's an incredibly difficult operating environment, there are so many things going on in this space now that inaction is going to really, really very substantially cause your business problems and potentially failure. And I won't go through these in detail, but again, I'm happy to take questions on them in the Q&A. But we're seeing, for example, not just the employees of Amazon who rebelled to a point that the owner, Jeff Bezos, finally announced his own net zero carbon pledge, you know, one of the biggest businesses on the planet. We're also seeing the staff, 1,100 of them, of McKinsey, you know, the most premium consultancy firm on the globe, where 1,100 of their staff wrote an open letter to the New York Times and said, we're not prepared to work anymore for a consultancy whose clients are wrecking our planet. And several of those senior leaders left McKinsey. So, you know, we're operating in unprecedented times, and I could give you stories and examples around each of those 6. But trust me, every single one of these forces are driving disruptive change in the way all of us are going to be doing business. And any of you that have employees under the age of 30, I'll be amazed if you hadn't had conversations with them about what you're doing on your environmental track record. So we're at a point now where you basically have to be half dead as a member of the human race not to get the moral case. But the point is now that the moral case has been joined by a very clear business case. So the only question really is, how fast can you act and how can you do it in a way that will give your business the chances of being more competitive and more resilient for the future, bearing in mind you're going to get hit by stuff. So thinking about, is business as usual now in the current plan versus the kind of shifts that we ought to be making if we're doing our fair share of the changes, is a false binary set of options, because all these forces here on this slide are going to come and hit you if they're not already in the coming years. So that's the context. It's really very profoundly serious. How do you navigate all that? And with apologies for anyone who isn't an SME, the focus I was asked to put on this was for SMEs because you don't have anything like the depth of resources, capability, money, etc. So it's much more difficult when you're a smaller organisation in some ways to act on this. And again, for the bigger organisations in the audience, if you want to grill me about how much more you should be doing, I'd welcome that. So I boiled this down to a 6-point guide, and I'm just going to talk you through each one of these very simply. Know what your impacts actually are. We're going to come to the full value chain point. Identify what your risks are from that. Look at the full value chain, not just in techie terms, your scope 1 and 2. Does everybody understand scope 1, 2 and 3, by the way? Would it be helpful to decode that? Yep. I'm going to pick on this lady at the front to decode it. Can you just do a really simple explanation of scopes 1, 2 and 3?
Yeah, so scope 1 would be your emissions from your business, so your electricity and things like that.
That's scope 2.
Oh, is that scope 2?
Yeah. I'll do it. Scope 1 is what you directly control in your business. Scope 2, the carbon emissions that you buy in usually for heating and power. Scope 3 is up or downstream in your supply chain. So it might be where you source your raw tomatoes from. It might be what your customers do with your product. If you make shampoo, your biggest carbon emission will be the coal in the power station that heats the hot water, for example. So that's scopes 1, 2 and 3. Point 3 is you need to understand all of that at some level. This is sounding expensive. In a minute, I'm going to explain to you why it doesn't have to be. From that, you say, okay, what are my business's priorities? I'm not going to be able to solve all the world's problems. Let's focus this on what my priorities really are. Think about what the business case is for change. I'm going to give you a code for that. And then get into the subject matter. Again, getting the feeling of where you all are in the audience. It feels a very unnerving subject, but throwing yourself in and learning a little bit every day makes a huge difference. So, number 1, know your impacts. How do you do that? You know, you can't afford to go off and pay Kearney or Bain or PwC or any of those big guys a fortune to go and map what your carbon impacts are and look at your biodiversity and so on and so forth. Actually, there is tons and tons of free information out there already. So think about the very simple headings of what matters to your business. I've given you some of the big ones there. And then go on to Google. There's so much published stuff out there. And look at your sector reports. If you're a member of a trade body, they will be bound to have all kinds of stuff on your sector. And critically, look at your competitors, particularly your big competitors. If you've got organisations that are listed companies on the FTSE 250, pretty much all of them now will have sustainability reports, and they'll publish tons of data that will give you a frame of reference. So to start with, you barely need to spend any money at all. You can do a huge amount of this just through legwork, because it really doesn't matter if you're 100% right. If you can see, roughly speaking, where your impacts really are, and you're 20% out, that won't change the kinds of actions that it would be a good idea for you to make. So there's a great kind of need amongst people to, you know, get the decimal point in the right place and get things precise. I would urge you to not let great be the enemy of the good in this field, and to really understand at a most broad level where your big impacts come. The second one then is about how you identify your risk. And you can do it in all sorts of ways. This is just a very simple risk map. There are other ways of doing risk maps. In effect, what you're mapping is probability and impact at the simplest possible level. So what you want to say is, okay, what sorts of things could hit us given what we know our areas of vulnerability are? Could we end up, as we've got now, with huge crop failure? We've seen that India already are looking at they're projecting about half the normal wheat crop as a result of the extreme heat that they suffered in April and May. So that's the kind of thing that's going to become more and more common. So understanding where you get the goods and services from that you depend on for your business, and understanding the vulnerability that they have got from the kinds of changes that I've described is absolutely crucial. Sometimes it will be security supply, sometimes it will be just cost. Either of those are quite significant. Tax and EPR. Shall I explain EPR? Extended Producer Responsibility. The idea is very simple, which is that if you're the organisation or the company that caused the problem, eventually you get taxed for the cost of cleaning it up. So plastic pollution is a classic example there. And what you can see is you can see governments doing lots and lots of policy work and lots of signalling at the moment about taxing things. So, of course, they decided to tax non-recycled plastic in packaging. And so everybody's now running around trying to source recycled plastic. Guess what? The guys who can actually sell it can sell it pretty much name their price. The same thing is happening now with textiles. We're seeing more and more countries looking at carbon pricing and carbon markets. Just yesterday, this government said that they want to consult on the idea of an import carbon tax, so that, again, partly tackling the offshoring problem and partly equaling out competitive cost. Because if you've got something being shipped in from China with huge carbon impacts and the UK's put a price on carbon for domestic goods, it's completely unfair, right? So there's lots and lots happening in the tax and the policy world. And as you know, governments are really, really good at making things cost more money. So that's a critical area to get your heads around. Understanding what all that does to your cost base, thinking about physical risk. You know, we're seeing floods in places that never happened before. There are great maps that you can get for free from the Environment Agency, from government, from universities about projection of future flood risk areas and fire risk areas. Understand what they are, understand where your employees are, and think about what your customers are doing, because a lot of them will be saying, actually, we want to work now with organisations that have got a lower impact. If you don't know any of that, your business is vulnerable. You can lose customers without even having the right conversation about what the real drivers are now for how they choose suppliers, other than obviously price and quality. So that's the second thing, is identify what your risks are. And then the reason, this lady raised exactly the right point, the reason this is so critical to understand your full value chain is that for almost any business, including a service business, your own operation, that scopes 1 and 2, is a tiny proportion of your full value chain. And by the way, that's even true again for our sponsors today, NatWest. Well, anybody like to guess where almost all of their carbon emissions come from in their full value chain? Obviously, NatWest people aren't allowed to answer. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Those that know or can't answer?
Customers driving to branches?
Just for my customers in general.
It's who they lend money to do what. So NatWest lend to companies that represent 25% of GDP. Do they invest in coal mines, or do they invest in turbine makers? Boiled down at a very simplistic level, okay? So the carbon footprint of the companies that they lend to are massive, absolutely massive. So what Alison Rose has done, the CEO, is to announce and drive through a very radical policy to decarbonise the lending book. By contrast, you know, the amount of energy that's consumed in their own branches is teeny. It still matters, but it's teeny. You see here in that first line here, this is taken from my days at Unilever. This is based on a shampoo sold in America. Actually, what you see there is, this is all about, as I said earlier, the energy source used to heat the water for washing your hair. You look at the bottom one, which is based on the work I did with Primark. That is all about how the fabrics are sourced, made, dyed, woven, and turned into clothes and then shipped. So if Primark said, we've got a zero carbon target by the end of the decade, great, but it's not. That's definitely not going to crack it, is it? So it's absolutely crucial. And in both cases, there are things that you can do. Particularly, Primark, for example, have said that by the end of this decade, they will only work with suppliers who they themselves have halved their carbon emissions this decade. And we've mapped that that is doable and will not cost those suppliers any more money because their grids are going to decarbonise anyway. But the point is, they are saying we can pull a much bigger lever if we think about how we set standards of who we're prepared to trade with than we can simply by what we do in our own operations. Then you have to do one of these things, which is, the fancy term is a materiality map, which is basically saying, what are the issues that really, really matter? So on the vertical axis, you've got the issues that matter most to society or to the world, or whichever language you want to use. And along the bottom, you've got an axis which is, and which of those issues really matter to us as an organisation? And again, this is judgment call. This isn't informed by 59 pages of Excel spreadsheets and Gantt charts. This is you knowing your business and understanding what really matters in your organisation that also matters to the world. And what that should take you directly to is your sense of what your priorities are and how you build a business case for action. And the crucial one I just want to call out here is the top one. Because if you move quickly on key material elements of sustainability, it can give you first mover advantage. So I'm working with Heineken at the moment, who've been the first to take out huge amounts of plastic packaging. And they've done, at the moment, they're piloting this in their home country of the Netherlands. And the impact on sales and brand preference has been significant because they've been the first to really seriously tackle the issue. My time at Unilever, we created sustainable-based brands, and those brands grew 67% faster than the rest of the portfolio. So the reason for this is very simple, which is that consumers want to be more responsible. In fact, consumers are worried out of their minds about what's happening to the planet. What they need, though, is they need brands and businesses to decode for them in a way that they trust and they can understand what being more responsible actually means. If you crack that code and you do it authentically and you deliver before you start shouting about it, these are all the caveats, then you can have a very significant growth potential on your hands. And that's a very important thing to understand because at the moment people see sustainability as all downside and all cost, and that's absolutely part of it, but it's absolutely not the whole picture. But the other things you should ask yourself is, right, would action on plastic or biodiversity, if we sourced only sustainably sourced ingredients, for example, what would that do to our long-term risk? Would it give us greater security of supply? If we think that far out and we build partnerships with organisations that are trying to do that well, would that actually give us more manageable costs for the long term? And crucially, in a world where the relationship between business and communities is very broken, the trust levels are very low, what does this do to build up your licence to operate again? And if sustainability actions don't fit any of those four, then don't do them. Because you're not a charity, you're a business. But that's a very simple framework that the whole of Unilever now uses for the whole of its business planning to think about how it's driving value into the business. And then the final one is just soak yourself in the subject a bit. Understand the science. Understand what the debates are about what needs to be done. Understand where all the solutions are. My God, that every day the inventions and scaling of those inventions is, it gives me hope in what can be a very depressing world that I occupy. Understand who's leading in the sector and steal with pride. Use every shortcut that you possibly can to see what's going on and how it applies to your business. And also, critically, understand where investors are going. And investors are on their own very, very steep learning curve here at the moment. And then a lot of them are not sure what questions to ask. They think ESG stocks are good, but now they don't. So that's confusing as well. And understanding, any of you that are trying to raise finance, think about who's going to invest in your business, what questions are they going to ask, what are the drivers in your sector, and again, where can you get competitive advantage out of really translating insight into action and plans in your organisation. And this is just a range of channels. I don't know if any of you subscribe to Business Green. It's an online publication. I get no money for saying this, by the way, but I personally find it absolutely invaluable. It's basically a business publication, but it looks at things through an environmental lens and top quality insights and business application, along with all the other things that are on the list there. And if any of you haven't done any of those are the simple steps to start taking. If you have, go back and check that you've pushed yourselves hard enough. Ask whether you're really thinking in the right way competitively. How's this going to really drive strength into the business? Are we unleashing the capability that already exists in the business, particularly with the younger people who are miles ahead of us on a lot of this? And see this not just as another sort of pressure, but as a source of opportunity as well. And fundamentally recognise that the businesses that are doing this well don't see sustainability as a thing they do on the side when they've got time. It is part of strategy. And increasingly it will be strategy as taxes and all the other pressures come to collide on our ability to operate in what we thought was the old normal, because that old normal is never coming back. But most fundamentally recognise this, and this goes right back to what Mark Carney was saying. It doesn't matter how smart you are, how good you are, how well you understand the sector. If you're not getting on the front foot now, you're already on the back foot. And the probability is, therefore, that you will be overtaken by organisations that are getting to that future faster and dealing with all the other things you have to deal with, but also addressing what our role is in creating a livable planet, because you ain't going to have a business on one otherwise, but how you both marry the moral case and the business case and build a more resilient business for the long term as a result. Questions? Sorry, it's sobering stuff, isn't it? I could do the gin and tonic. I don't know about you.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I thought I was second. I thought you were pointing to somebody else. All right. Okay.
Can you just tell me who you are and what you do, so I know who?
Yeah. My name's Michael Hallam. I live in Lancaster. I founded something called the Ethical Small Traders Association 12 years ago, which has got 4 bottom lines, and it encourages its member businesses and organisations to at least be aware of them. The 3 obvious ones, environment, society, and resources. But the 4th one is a recognition of the importance of lifelong learning and personal self-development. And that was what I wanted to sort of ask you about, because you know, the point that was referred to earlier, which is what difference does it make, does my action make on the world? Well, not a lot. But if you ask the question, what does the difference does my action make to me, to my life and the people around me, it can be huge. So that inner development, to me, that's missing. I mean, when I look at the SDG goals, which are recently, there's not much in there directly about us learning and becoming more self-actualized people. And I think that's a critical part of the equation. So I just wondered what you had to say about that.
Well, as you know, it was my 6th point on my 6-point guide to getting started. And I think more generally, you know, I worked in business for a long time, and I've observed, frankly, worryingly, even now amongst some organisations, that there is still this view that the environment is a wholly owned subsidiary of the economy. And of course, the reverse is true. You can't do business on a dead planet, and an understanding of the interdependency. That's why this phrase, what is the true cost of doing business, is so fundamental. And it's very intimidating. And so it's crucial that at a human level you connect with the unbelievable joys of this planet. I mean, just, well, maybe not so much looking outside, but if we could look that way, just driving up here, the last couple of junctions, the beauty is just stunning. And I think we need to stay in touch with that and with the simple pleasures. And we need to have the courage to confront the fact that things are changing very quickly. There's a lot we don't understand, but we need to connect much more deeply with the facts. That's why I started where I started, and I always do, no matter what the audience. So you really understand what the human race on a planet that's existed for millions of years, what we've managed to do as the most intelligent species in 150 years. You know, it's astonishing, and it's astonishingly bad, and it is irrecoverable, just. But we all have to lean in, and we all have to learn. So I think it's absolutely fundamental, and we all have to confront ourselves, and we have to confront that fear of another change. Really, it's hard. Trust me, it's going to be a lot harder if we don't lean in. This is really just designed to keep him fit. Let me know who you are and what you do.
So my name's Peter Mather. I'm director of 1662 Limited. So we are set up as a sustainable engineering consultancy, delivering project management and engineering design. So we are after the consultation phase, when businesses have this action plan in place and the consultants have left and they're looking at the stark reality of what they need to do to make shifts and changes, and they struggle to resource that internally. That's where we come in and say, we'll deliver that for you. So we're absolutely fundamentally passionate about only working with industries that are on the net zero strategy, aligned with exactly the things you've just been speaking to.
Great. We need everybody to do what he's doing. Just saying,
We're
no,
open for
don't.
business, by the way.
Yeah, but just don't work with businesses that haven't got a net zero strategy anymore. If everybody did that, boy, it'd change quickly.
So my question, because I absolutely agree with everything you've said there today fundamentally, is around growth. So the big challenge I see when you're dealing with talking with industry and businesses is, having read Professor Stephen Emmett's 10 billion, which I'm sure you're familiar with, there's a reality check that actually what we need to be doing is also reducing consumption, as well as all the good stuff about becoming more efficient and using it in a more effective way.
Yeah.
And that flies in the face of business, because that scares the life out of most managing directors, because if they reduce and the competition doesn't, all of a sudden they're in a weaker position.
Yeah.
And it's really how you advise on the challenge of how and where we reduce, and maybe that's where government should step in and put caps and limits on, and taxes which force the market effectively unilaterally. I don't know whether that's a good idea. Over to you, really.
What do we do about growth? Yeah. Well, Adam Smith said growth is just a phase in economies, and he was right. I think we need growth, but we need the right kind of growth for the next kind of phase of transition. Why do I say that? Because we need economic activity that will fuel the change, pardon the pun. We need businesses that are reducing their carbon footprint, their methane emissions, their use of plastic, all the things that are causing the fundamental problems we face. We need those to win share at the expense of companies that are not moving quickly enough. That's the brilliant thing about markets, is when you've got a better proposition and you make it clear to people, and they believe you and they understand it, they will buy that alternative version, so long as the price is still competitive and the product quality is competitive. So you can't compromise on those two things. But so Primark, my recent big client, they're renowned for what's fast fashion. And lots of people said to me when I started to work with them, they're like a massive source of the problem, aren't they? Well, they are at the moment, but what they will become is certainly a significantly better, lower impact company, both in absolute terms and compared with a large number of their high street competitors. And for the foreseeable future, what companies can do is they can be the more responsible alternative that's still driving down the things that are bad, but creating employment, paying taxes, doing all the other things that we need to build some of the infrastructure that's needed. Where you get to really serious questions is your point about what do you do on the demand side? What do you do with the fact that we've got a consumer-based society? Will we ever get to the point where consumers self-regulate and say, I want less? Well, honestly, I don't know. Will it happen quickly enough, I think, is probably the more material question. But you see now significant shifts in meat eating here in this country. You see now significant shifts away from car ownership amongst people under 30. Of course, a lot of those are stimulated by other things as well, like cost and health. But who cares if it's a move in the right direction and sustainability is a part of them. So I think we're seeing weeks in some areas. Consumerism is going to change. By seeing it in fast fashion, where some of the fastest growing brands are organisations that do resale. So there's a platform called Vinted, for example, that's had its third funding round and is valued at $53 million after only a few years. So from stock, that's in America, you know, home of the cynics, supposedly, in this area. Eventually, the major shifts we need to see, I think, will have to be made by government. And the thing that worries me there, again, is global competitiveness and who goes first. So I think we're in for a very difficult 10 years of policy making, unless the UN can draw agreements around things like carbon pricing. But even major blocks like the EU can make a big difference, and they are, you know, in the lead on that at the moment. Bit of a long answer, but it's a critical question.
Hello, is that on?
Yeah. Oh, you're the director of...
Yeah, no, don't worry about that. I'm going to ask my question. Sorry, Brian Gregory, and thank you very much. I'm going to ask my question from the with the Hat of Trustmark on, which is another organisation I work with. And what the gentleman said down at the front there about it's about reducing our usage. Certainly from an energy point of view, is very true, and that's the government policy at the moment. And you talked about the true cost of, let's call it products, whatever those products might be. Now then, we are only just getting to the true cost of what we should be paying for our energy. My question is around the role the media plays.
The
role the media plays.
The role the media plays?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've got two examples here, smoking and wearing seatbelts.
I worked on both the campaigns for that, by the way.
Still work. No, they were great campaigns because they created a social pariah of those people very quickly, didn't they? And
10 years it took, actually.
The public monitored that, but this isn't new either, isn't this? Decarbonisation, this isn't new either.
Yeah.
Where they didn't get traction with things like electric cars and organic material, organic food.
Yeah.
Failed to get. So why do you think, assuming you agree with some of what I've said, why is the media, instead of telling the world how badly done to they are because now they've got to pay the true cost of their energy, are taking the isn't this bad and oh poor you?
Well, on the true cost of energy, this isn't a direct answer to your question, by the way, but I will get to it. The government's response in its energy security strategy missed out the two most significant things that would have reduced householder bills and got us to the future energy economy that we need at a domestic level, which were insulating everybody's homes. If you insulated everybody's homes, that would reduce the average EPC, which is the efficiency rating in a building, from D to C. That would have saved 20% of gas bills like that. You could have done a large amount of that in the next 2 years, so it's immediate. And yeah, exactly, just appalling, and a fraction of the cost that we're pouring into still subsidising the fossil fuel industries. And the other would be to encourage people when they are about to change their heating system anyway because their boiler's packed up, or anybody who's building a new estate right now, putting in thousands and thousands of gas boilers, to put in air source heat pumps instead. and to subsidise that at some level so that you accelerate the volume of those units being made, so you get to a point where the price drops, like every other technology, right? It's about scale, volume and price. And I can tell you, I have an air source heat pump. I have a 300-year-old farmhouse. It was -5 outside at points in the winter. It was a happy 22 degrees in our bedroom. The technology is absolutely proven. And most of the experts now, there's a bit of wittering on about hydrogen as an alternative domestic supply, because some people think you can shut down the gas pipes. But most people now say, first of all, there's a carbon footprint associated with hydrogen, and air source heat pumps are completely carbon neutral. So the government didn't do either of those things. So I think we start with a failure of policy making and consistent policy ambition from the government. They have flip-flopped on every important piece of policy making that they've had to do in this area in recent months. And frankly, it's appalling. The media are not going to step up and do a job of educating people, because they have a different agenda. A lot of them, frankly, are owned by big organisations who are not sympathetic to this agenda. The big thing that's missing is exactly what you said at the start, which is a public information campaign, which these ladies, who I used to work with 20 years ago, Joan and Drusilla, when we worked in advertising, we worked on big public information campaigns funded by the Central Office of Information, which David Cameron disbanded in his wisdom. And there is no repository of how you create mass behaviour change anymore. And that is the massive chasm, because people are crying out for better understanding and the ability to play their small part in whatever way they can. Not to be judged for the things that they can't or won't change, but to make a contribution where they can make a change. And there are so many more things that people could be doing that they're not doing, primarily, in my view, sorry to be political, but because of the failures of this government, both in terms of policy and in terms of public information.
To what extent?
Sorry.
Quickly, one last question, because it's such a fascinating discussion, but yeah.
To what extent is democracy the problem?
Is democracy the problem?
Yeah, to what extent does democracy
Yeah.
as a political system doom this to failure?
Yeah.
Because it allows vested interests to resist it and stop all of those other things that you just mentioned.
Well, if China were doing a brilliant job, I'd say you've got a really good case. And I don't mean to sound facetious, by the way, because it's a very profound question. But when you unpack the forces of change, voter intention is absolutely crucial. And there I have some hope. So Mori, you've all heard presumably of Mori polling. They have been tracking voter sentiment for decades. And they track the top 10 drivers of voting intention. You know, health, jobs, transport, etc. And those have barely changed in the last 25 years. They change in their priority, but it's a very stable set of data. When Theresa May was elected, policy on climate change was not in the top 10. Now it's top. I mean, that is the reason I explain how stable the data normally is so you understand how quickly and how radically the public mood has shifted. So that's a good indicator, but it's not enough. It's not enough because of the reason the previous gentleman said, that actually people don't really know quite what good looks like. What are they voting for? They know what they don't like, but they don't know what good policies would look like. The parties that have got the best policies have got very little critical mass. And so their ability to actually cut through and scale quickly enough to win an election is marginal. There are severe challenges to the current economic model, and so you need courageous government. And critically, when you're a small island that's just divorced itself from your major trading partner, bearing in mind I think Brexit was a not very wise move, your ability to destabilise your economy in the middle of a medium-term cost of living crisis is pretty marginal. But actually the single biggest issue is what I mentioned before, is that we need some major shifts to become law across the world very quickly. Now that's happening on a voluntary basis, which is amazing. And we see more and more countries that have introduced legally enshrined a net zero carbon target, but it's by 2050. So either you say, let's try and accelerate towards that and make our big shifts really soon, which is what we need, which is why I started by asking everybody if you know what the Ipcc target is. Because frankly, if we don't make significant shifts by 2030, it's going to get very, very bad. And of course, at that point, either the world will come together or it will completely splinter and people will become very inward-looking and who knows which way they will go. So what we need is we need a more enlightened public. We need better political leadership. I think the democratic system in theory can deliver it, but we need parties with a critical mass that have got the courage and the vision to work with economists who can design that new future. That's been done, by the way. So Gordon Brown commissioned a study by Lord Stern that showed how you decarbonise the economy in a way that builds its resilience rather than knocking it to pieces. So the knowledge is there, the technology's there, it's about the systems and the will. Yeah, if we'd done what we said we would do at Rio, we'd have been looking at a compound rate of 2% reduction a year, you know. Anyway, we're not, so we have to deal with it now.
I am so sorry, Sue, and the audience, that we're going to have to draw this to a close, but it's been absolutely fascinating, fantastic presentation, but equally really super considered questions from you guys. So I'd like you to join me in showing our appreciation for Sue and the presentation. Thank you. And we do have an opportunity to continue networking outside, and Sue will be there, so you can ask her any more questions. I mean, it strikes me it is depressing and it's urgent, but there are sort of tendrils of hope, and there are foundations at least we can build on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
go out and do it, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.